So you should know what common property resources are at this point. In here, we're going to articulate the model of the tragedy of the commons. And the idea is that there's basically a fixed production capacity, and the individuals that are using it have pecuniary externalities for everyone else. So that if I have a little bit, if I take a little bit more, if I pull more fish out, or I leave less in the forest, or whatever, that's leaving there less for all the other people who are producing and using it. But I want to begin, before we get into a common property problem, to just recap the private problem. Here we'll have a situation where we have a farmer who's got a field, and he has to figure out how many goats he wants to put on that field. He then, goats eat the grass from the field, and then he milks the goats, gets the milk, makes some cheese, sells some milk, drinks it, sells it, whatever. He's a small farmer. He's a price taker overall in the market for goats, so that if he uses 5 goats or 10 goats, the marginal cost for each additional goat stays the same. The goats are being provided by somewhere else. So that means marginal cost is just constant in the number of goats. Call that marginal cost, which will make A. And notice, of course, that total cost, given that there's constant marginal cost, total cost would be an upward sloping line with a slope of A, because each individual goat adds a constant increment to total cost. But here we're concerned about how the farmer chooses how many goats to farm on his field, and so he's only going to pay attention to marginal costs and, of course, marginal returns. Each goat you have, you'll get back the milk from that goat, but that's going to leave a little less food for the other goats, so you wind up in a situation of diminishing marginal product. Say that's marginal product. And so we'll wind up with some optimum, we'll call that here, which is G star. So that's the optimal amount of goats you'd want to put on your green, taking into account that as you add more and more goats, that means there's less grass for all the other goats to be eating, which is that why your marginal product is declining in the number of goats. Now, the tragedy of the commons arises because, unlike the privately held situation, as you add an additional goat, you don't take into account the fact that this lowers the output of all the other goats who would be owned by other people. You only think about the goats that are your own. So what's your product that's useful for making your decision about whether or not to add another goat to the commons? Well, all the goats are on the commons, they get grazed, each one produces a given amount of milk. We'll call that the average product, so that's the total milk divided by the number of goats. And so when I add another goat, that gives me another share of the milk from the common, so I wind up then getting the average product of the goats in the common rather than the marginal product. Now notice, in a setting as we have with diminishing marginal product, that means the average product is always going to be above the marginal product, because the average product will be the sum of all the lower levels of product, which were higher. So here we could draw the average product always above the marginal product as such. And given that we just divide up the milk from all of our goats grazing on the green, we wind up then with some amount G, we'll call that GT for tragedy, that we decide to add to the green. So that's the nature of the tragedy of the commons problem. Because individuals are getting as a return on extracting from the commons their average product instead of their marginal product, people end up over-consuming the resource. And this kind of model, though we've done it here in terms of goats, you could think of the same model with regards to a number of fish that you pull out of a common fishery, amount of firewood, fodder, etc., that you pull out of a common forest. That doesn't need to just be goats, but it is worthwhile thinking about how you would draw marginal costs in those alternative settings, as well as whether or not this average product story that's driving the tragedy is appropriate in all of those. Good luck.